Going on with our agenda, I would like to introduce you to my panelists for our panel that we're having now. I can see them both. Perfect. So first of all, hello, ladies. I'll say hello to Rachael Gallagher, Privacy Policy Manager EMEA from Meta, and Natascha Gerlach, Director of Privacy and Data Policy from the Center for Information Policy Leadership. Hello, thank you for taking the time and for joining us in our panel. What role does data protection play in the development of age-appropriate digital services? A very interesting topic that I'd like to discuss with you today. So, I hope you're all doing well.
Yes, fine. Thank you. Thank you for having us. I guess I'm speaking for you, Rachael, but I'm assuming you're also happy to be here.
Yeah, delighted. Yeah, it's actually my birthday, so I can't think of a better way
Happy birthday.
Oh, happy birthday. We didn't know that beforehand. Yeah. Otherwise, we would have had some balloons or something. Yeah, so congratulations and happy birthday. And yeah, but then let's start. Rachael, the first question directly to you. What does it take to develop and operate age-appropriate digital services?
Yeah, I mean, it really, I think, like, I know the title of the session is very much around like the data protection element of it, but I think definitely at Meta anyway, when it comes to actually like designing and even operating a digital service, it's really about like a multidisciplinary approach. So data protection is a very, very important lens to look at in terms of designing for young people, but it's only one lens, and it's really, really important that we're also considering like safety and also content as well, which I know we'll maybe talk a little bit more about. And so I think because of this multi-disciplinary approach and the fact that we're a global company, we're very much guided by like three overarching principles that we use. And one is really around empowering young people, and doing so responsibly. So we feel like our platforms are a really good place for young people, you know, to be able to freely express themselves, to be able to connect with their peers, you know, to be able to follow like other activists as well. Like I'm thinking about like the Greta Thunbergs and people like that. So it provides like, I think, a very, very rich experience for young people, but it's very important that that's done in a safe way. And so safety and privacy are very much paramount to like making sure that happens in an age appropriate way. And in terms of our platform, like we provide protections for all users, but we then have additional protections for young people. And then I think the third principle that guides us in the world that we live in these days is around innovation. That we continue to innovate and build new products, but we do so in a way that really considers the privacy and safety of young people as well. That's probably in terms of approach. But then I think like what's key to it all is the way that products are designed. And this is very much around like product teams. So we spend like a lot of our efforts actually educating product teams, like around like how to actually design products in the best interests of the child, which is a lot of like these, I suppose, the regulations and the frameworks we see. That's a very important concept. But for the likes of product teams, that can be quite an abstract concept because they just build. So like, what does this mean in practice for them? So what we've actually done is taken like guidance, like DPA guidance, such as ICO, Age Appropriate Design Code, and the IDPC Children's Fundamentals, and also the UNCRC. And we've tried to like distill some key considerations for product teams to have in the forefront of their mind when they're building new products. And we feel like this helps. So like, for example, like one of the things is we very much, you know, want to emphasize to product teams that they're building for a global audience. So it's not just for young people in the US or young people in the EU. They have to have this kind of global, I think, viewpoint when they're doing that. And also what we try and do and product teams try and do is balance, on one hand, the autonomy of young people and, you know, them making decisions for themselves, but then counteracting this against maybe the responsibility like of parents and empowering parents to support their teens in actually using the service as well. And contrary to what people might think, the third thing that really guides us is the fact that, you know, we prioritize the safety of young people over business interests. And I say that because I know there's probably a lot of people like listening in who are just like, well, that's not true. But the fact is there's no business imperative in actually not doing that. There's none. And as a mother to a young child as well, I mean, that's very important for me that I work for a company that does have that in mind. But I suppose that's all to say that this helps them product teams really build for the global audience and really try and promote consistency as much as possible through like across all these different jurisdictions that we design for.
Mm-hmm. Of course, we do have a lot of regulation, and which regulations in the EU and in the member states especially need to be observed? Perhaps to both of you. Natascha, would you like to start?
Yeah, I think so. Rachael touched on a number of these, and you know, they're sort of, that's the framework in which we operate here. CIPL actually created a paper last year that tried to identify key challenges in this particular space on child privacy and child protection. But what we also did in this paper, apart from identifying the key touch points that we have there and that need to be further discussed, is to map globally, not just within the EU or EEA, the various legal frameworks and pieces of legislation that we can see either emerging or that are already there, which create this jigsaw puzzle of you know, legislation that organizations such as Meta or Google or any even small startup trying, you know, most startups are born global. So even, you know, to the extent that they are intended to be reached by children or are likely to be accessed by them, that is something to look into. But I think if we focus on Europe, then for us, obviously, the GDPR, of which everybody now has heard, is sort of the, you know, that's the big piece. And it does have some special considerations for children's data protection, like setting the floor for the age of consent. Although there is some divergence within the member states as to where you land within the space that the GDPR gives. So again, that's another fragmentation that organizations have to contend with when they are trying to design something that would be usable across markets. You know, this Article 8, and then there is, you know, concerns around parental consent for informational society services that are specifically set out in the Recital 38, and then Recital 58 that has instructions on the transparency vis-a-vis children. So that's sort of the baseline, I would say. And on top of that come other legislative pieces. I think most prominently recently the DSA, the Digital Services Act, that also addresses children's data protection and privacy specifically. For instance, prohibits advertising to minors based on profiling, so on their behavior online or their preferences. It requires appropriate and proportionate measures to ensure minors' privacy, their safety online, and potential for age verification and parental control tools, and appropriate risk mitigation measures there. And it also sets out, which is very interesting, in particular in the context of age verification and age assurance, that compliance should not lead to the processing of more data. And that can be quite tricky when you're trying to set this up, when you're trying to figure out, well, am I dealing with a minor? And if I am dealing with a minor, what kind of a service am I? Do I need to keep the minor out? Do I just need to ensure that, you know, the individual is above a certain age? Because in the end, children are very motivated to access. You know, we know that from the analog world, they are motivated to access those things that try to keep them out. So, you know, the approach to that must be based on the risk that it places before the child. And then, you know, we have the Audiovisual Media Services Directive that has to be, or had to be, implemented in the various member states, I believe by 2020. So there will be, you know, individual pieces of legislation in the member states that may also diverge. And that's a more sectoral piece because it addresses specific industries. And this comes again also with requirements around transparency, so that the viewers need to be informed about what they are about to see and whether or not it could be harmful, etc. And then and Rachel touched on that already. I think the UK's age-appropriate design code, in fact, plays a huge role in this field because it has become a roadmap for many companies. And even now, as we see new pieces emerging or being discussed, the first question tends to always be, is this diverging from the UK's age-appropriate design code? Because parts of these, they have been exported to the US, we see Australia, etc. And so this plays a huge role. Rachel, I don't know if that's also your experience on when you advise, for instance, your product teams.
Yeah, definitely. The age appropriate design code like has really been, I suppose, the North Star. It's kind of like set the trend, and has been like a very, very important framework. And I think like one of the things that we see, and I'm sure like lots of companies, and Natascha, you see this as well, is we're seeing like this youth legislation and these regulatory frameworks across different disciplines. So there's DPAs that are very interested in this issue. There's safety regulators that are interested in this. And both EU and member states are legislating on the protection of children online as well. And very often what might seem like a good thing to write down in a law has very significant consequences from a practical implementation perspective. And sometimes we see not so much like tensions, but maybe unintended tensions. Tensions is probably a good way of putting it, between these various regimes, because one word difference can actually be a huge difference, as I said before, in with regards to implementation. And so this is something that we try and work through. And I think one of the most useful tools that we use to try and like tease out some of these nuances and these like unintended tensions is a privacy forum that we set up last year. So this is a Meta EU Youth Privacy Forum. Doesn't exactly roll off the tongue, but the whole point of the forum was to bring together like experts and academics and policymakers and regulators as well from right across all the disciplines, so not just privacy, to look at like key policy topics such as, Natascha, you mentioned age assurance, but also like parental consent, parental controls. So all of these things, and to really have a conversation and discussion around that from the multidisciplinary perspective. And that's been really, really helpful to us, and I'm sure other industry players as well, in thinking about like implementing some of these things. I suppose just to come back to the point around like the EU legislation and member state legislation, like one of the things that we find like is really helpful and can help maybe like bridge the gap and come to some kind of like common understanding are standards around different things. So like I'm aware that there's currently standards work ongoing in the age assurance field. But also like we really, really welcome like the EU Commission's age appropriate code of conduct as well that it's working on. And similarly, like I can maybe touch a bit more on this later as well, but the GDPR code of conduct. So codes like that really, I think, go some way in helping to kind of create this benchmark across industry. So yeah, just a couple of thoughts from
I think that's super important. And so CIPL, for instance, is a member of the special group of the Commission that is engaged with drafting this code, and that's going to be really, that's a bit longer term. That's going to be really interesting. And so all these pieces play into that, and you have to consider what's already there. And I think one important point that we here in Europe and most of the world are considering when we design this, when we think about this, is this idea of the best interest of the child, which sits sort of on top of everything as well. But that also means that it's, and Rachel said that earlier, it's not just about privacy. Private data protection and privacy is not an absolute right, for one. And there are other rights that also children have. And this idea of best interest of the child may mean that policymakers and regulators and companies actually as well have to reconcile what looks like maybe even competing concerns, because it's also about safety. It's about keeping children out of harm's way, clearly, but then it's also about their rights, and how do we make to them available the resources and the information they need and they have a right to, and respect their growing maturity, and they can develop and have a full online life, if you will, and they can evolve their capacities as they move toward adulthood. And then we also need to, and companies like Meta, for instance, have to consider that eventually there's a question of privacy vis-a-vis the parental units, right? Whoever the guardian is, because if we've all been there. You grow up and you want more privacy, and you have a right to more privacy vis-a-vis your parents. And how does that work? And what are the transparency requirements there that you have to build in, so that the child is at least, or the minor is at least aware of whether or not a parent is looking at their online activity, etc. So that's the other piece that we have to contend with here.
What are the key building blocks, and what is the role of data protection and related transparency in particular? And what role does perhaps also codes of conduct play for Natascha?
Yeah, no, I think we touched on that, and Rachael already teed that off. So I think, as I said, data protection is just one of the building blocks when it comes to looking at children in the digital environment. And I said it's not an absolute right, and the Lisbon Treaty promotes the protection of child rights, but there are other rights that have to be weighed potentially against that, including rights of grown-ups, as we see in the CSAM discussion, right? So it's a very tricky balance, but I do think the GDPR sets out some of the fundamental principles to be baked into systems like privacy by design and by default, data minimization, and the instructions I mentioned earlier that the GDPR sets out in the recitals for special consideration when it comes to children. And then for transparency, transparency and transparency notices are fundamental to trust in a service or an app, right? It's essential for privacy protection, for the consent that is maybe being requested to be valid. But it also it has to inform children and their families about how the data is used, and that may present challenges because when you present this to children, it has to be in a language they also understand. And I think at the beginning to any of these questions when it comes to children's privacy they're always quite similar. What are we trying to achieve here? Are we trying to keep children out because the content is inappropriate? Is this true for all age groups, for instance? Do we have to differentiate there, which may also have an impact on your transparency? Do we just limit certain parts of the offering and others are fine, etc.? Or are we trying to keep others out of the space, for instance, right? And that's another question there. And so what information do we need, and do the users need for that? And when is it best to present this? And I think that's sort of the challenge you have, right? When at what point of entering the service of interacting is this important? And something that Rachael said earlier about codes of conduct, I think what is important there is that they can sort of create a set of common standards that organizations across different industries can implement, and it enhances the transparency because it's visible. There are certain hoops you have to jump through in order to be certified under the code. It's consistent. It creates trust. In particular, also if you have, let's say, a third-party verification agency there, and it can be a blueprint for future guidance. Right now, we're waiting for guidance, for instance, from the European Data Protection Board on children's data, and a code of conduct, in particular one that is under Article 40 of the GDPR, and that has to be approved, right, by the DPA and then also by DTPP. It can fill that gap, and it can, in the meantime, foster some of this trust that is needed there, and also provide a blueprint for incoming guidance. And Tech Ireland is currently working on such a code of conduct. And Rachael, I think you can probably talk to that a little bit.
Yeah, certainly. So Technology Ireland is currently leading an effort on behalf of industry at the minute around a GDPR code of conduct on young people, but it will focus on transparency and data subject rights. And there's like although the project's in its infancy, like it's early days, we have been having some initial discussions with the IDPC. But a project like that, I think it's really helpful because it helps to kind of create this benchmark right across industry, and like not just the big tech. Like when I say everyone, I mean all players, like anyone offering an online service to children. And I think this is really beneficial, obviously for all players, but particularly like young people, so that they themselves start to know what to expect from companies. Because at the minute, like, companies do it in such different ways, and that will continue, but having some sense of expectation in terms of how a privacy policy is written or what other opportunities there are to educate them, I think that's really helpful. And at the end of the day, it helps them empower young people themselves around their own data. But obviously also the rights and responsibilities of organizations too. So it's a kind of a win-win. But that project's in its infancy, and we're working through all the issues that Natascha has just mentioned. So a lot more to come on that. And if there are any companies that are interested in learning more, to reach out to myself or Technology Ireland on that one as well.
Mm-hmm. Another question for both of you. You mentioned it a little bit before. What are the key considerations for age-appropriate transparency, and what approaches can be taken to ensure the effectiveness of the measures that have been taken?
So from my end, I think I said it before, right? It's the questions: what are we trying to achieve here? Do we try to keep children out? Do we need to? Is this like a hard age gap, for instance? A gate. Do we? If you're not above a certain age, you can't access this for these and these reasons. Is this softer? So I think it's contingent on the risk that we are trying to prevent here, and so your measure must be appropriate. And proportionate to what you're trying to achieve. And the DSA is very clear. For instance, you can't collect more data than you absolutely need to verify what it is that you're trying to verify here, because it may be that certain age groups can certainly enter, or they can enter parts of the offering, etc. And I ultimately, to me at least, I think there is no one solution that ticks all the boxes. It's a risk-based approach in my view, and you may have more than one of the tools available in your toolkit that you have to deploy here. To come to the right agreement or the right approach.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think one of the other key considerations too, which is really, really important, I think, if companies can do it, is to actually involve young people in drafting their privacy notices and doing user testing and actually finding out what young people understand from the privacy notices. Because that's what it's all about, isn't it? The understandability element of it. And one of the things that we've done over the course of the past 6 months, really. But there's Meta has the TTC labs, which is the Trust, Transparency and Control labs, and they work a lot on really finding design solutions to actual policy problems or policy conundrums. Can't even say the word. And they've done a series of what's called co-design jams. So this is the current buzzword. I'm sure a lot of people out there have heard it, but again, it's just designing with young people themselves. So they've held a number of these what's called design jams, and it's just involving the young people in the creation of privacy policies. But those sessions have brought back really interesting findings, and some of the things that they found, they're not groundbreaking. I think we've heard them in DPA guidance, but it was really impactful to actually hear this directly from young people. So some of the things that were being surfaced was the importance of delivering education and privacy information at the right time. Mm-hmm. So yes, privacy policies are very important, But if you can do it in a way that relates to the actual context of what the young person's actually experiencing in their journey, it's way more impactful. So if they're being served with a decision to make online, or they're maybe downloading a new product, those are the times, or I suppose they're called just-in-time notices as well. A young person's more likely to be more impacted and understand that information more. Another one is obviously, I think it's no surprises, but like adapting to the young person's needs over time. And that can be a very challenging thing to do. I mean, obviously in the case of Meta, our services are aimed at children 13 and above, but for probably a lot of companies out there, it could be much younger. And so really finding the best way to communicate with children of different ages can be very challenging, but it's so important because it changes over time. So it's not just at one moment in time. You have to like reevaluate like what you've said, what age they were, what was their understanding at that time versus maybe 4, 5, 6 years down the line. And then another thing was around young people said, like, keep things clear, keep things easy to understand. Because if you give us a lot of information, we get overwhelmed and it all goes over our head. So give us what we need and when we need it. And then create opportunities like for co-learning, or in other words, give us opportunities that we can go away and have a conversation with our parent or guardian around something, to really like create that like two-way communication between parent and the young person. And then finally, like empower us, like let us know like what rights we have, how we enforce that. And ultimately, it's not just about data protection. It's about like our journey, understanding how to be safe online. And I know, sorry, we're coming probably shortly to the end of the panel, but one analogy that I thought was absolutely brilliant at a conference I attended, so I'm taking no kudos for this one, but like it should be very much like teaching a child how to cross the road safely. So their online experience should be something similar. So it's not like we're going to always be with their children every time they cross the road. Obviously when they're young, yes, but they'll come to the stage where they'll need to know themselves where to stop, when to press the button, to wait on the green man, as we call it in Ireland, to know to look right and left and right again before they cross the road, to remain vigilant. And the online experience and safety and privacy should be something similar, where we should be building these skills like for our young people to be responsible and to be aware of dangers themselves. But that does not negate from platforms and companies' responsibilities to obviously have those measures in place.
Mm-hmm. I think that's a great analogy, because it's not in all jurisdictions the same direction in which you look first, right? So exactly. This is the problem we have. So that works really well. And I couldn't agree more. I think participatory testing and design is really important. And kids are actually very smart, and they're very self-aware when it comes to, what online harms are out there, what benefits it has to them. There was a New York Times article a few weeks ago where they interviewed a number of teens about healthy social media behavior, for instance. And it was really reassuring to see the level of understanding they had and what ideas they have on how to do this. And it's something that, accountable organizations have been implementing for a while already. And then I think one important aspect when you start on this journey is to understand children's motivations. When you're designing age assurance, the analogy I have is it's like a big carnival, and there's a sign that says you have to be this tall to get onto the rides, and so children are very motivated to get on. So what do we do in the analog world that works to make sure they don't, and how can we learn from that and apply it in the digital world? Because we cannot look at this in a disconnected manner. It's all connected to the environment in which children also live, analog.
And what are your, we have 2 minutes left, so one last question. As you said it already, Rachael, from your own perspective, when you're looking from this perspective of a child, does it make sense to talk to your own children, to raise the awareness that there are some, not so easy tasks or obstacles to manage? Should society also try to raise those issues more?
Yeah, I mean, I think it all comes down to like there's different players in this that have responsibilities, and the companies have a very big responsibility, but there are other, players as well, or stakeholders that we need to think about in this. And as a parent myself, I'd like to think that, gosh, God knows what it'll be like when she's that age. But I would like to think that, I would be supporting her in the journey and just really enabling her to be able to talk to me about any issues that she's having. But that's something like at Meta as well we're really keen on, is encouraging I suppose generally the literacy around both young people and parents, and giving them that opportunity to really have difficult conversations sometimes. But yeah, it's something that we're very, very focused on.
Thank you, ladies, so much. Unfortunately, our panel is already over. Thank you so much for taking the time. It was very interesting.
Pleasure.
Thank you for sharing the information with us. And, well, join us on our app, Swapcard. You can talk to our participants, and I hope you'll follow the following panels and discussions that we have today. Thank you.
Thanks
Bye.
very much.
Thanks so much for joining us. Bye. Bye-bye.
Bye.